Welcome, everybody, to another episode of School Matters. I'm David Mustonen, Director of Communications for the Dearborn Public Schools. I want to thank everybody for taking a few minutes to join us today. We've got a great topic here, school budget, school finance. It seems to be one of those topics that you can talk about it every year, and it always is changing. And people sometimes forget how schools are funded and need refresher courses on all of that. And of course, because I am not the expert on any of those things, I've brought here today in the studio, joining us is our Executive Director of Business Services and Operations, Mr. Tom Wall. Tom, welcome.
Thank you for having me, David.
Yeah, appreciate it. You know, school finance, it is a complicated kind of thing. I was thinking about this earlier today. It's hard to believe that Proposal A is almost coming up on 30 years since school, which was probably the biggest change in school funding that has occurred. And here we are coming up on 30 years of it already. I think that it was a good place for us to start, just because people still have that concept of, which rightfully so, you know, they pay taxes in their local schools, their local city, and they feel that those taxes go right to the schools. And they do in a way, but Proposal A really kind of changed all of that. And that might be a good place for us to start, Tom, just that basic underlying how schools are funded.
Yeah, actually, I started in 1992 for schools as a business manager for a smaller district. And, you know, I've seen the whole range for the 30 years in the Proposal A environment. And I actually was an auditor before that. So I actually was auditing prior to that. So I've seen a long history of this and personally experienced it from being in the business side. So it's a roller coaster because, you know, funding is not always the same. It started off as a one model fit all, that you got a dollar value per student, and that's all you got. Now the state in the last several years have gone to more income based on your student population. So more money for special ed if you had a higher special ed, more money for ESL if you had a higher percentage in that. So it's starting to diverse a little bit. But again, the funding that one fits all, there's always winners and losers in every district. Some benefit better from it, others don't. So that's why you always see the rhetoric at the legislative level that, you know, we need change. After 30 years of one model, some of the districts feel that we need something different, and they're starting to move in that direction.
Well, I think that, you know, it is important that they are making those changes, because we do know that. So, for example, in a rural district, they may spend a lot of money on transportation because those buses are, you know, moving hundreds of miles every day around a big rural district. So their transportation cost may be a lot more than somewhere else. We know that special education students, because they may need special equipment or special learning resources, may cost more than a general ed student. So recognizing those differences is important.
Right, because we're a little over 30 square miles. And so even we have to decide where we have our boundary lines of who's eligible and who's not. So that's every district's dealing with that, and nobody gets any additional money for that. So it's an internal decision based on your priorities of your district. We love to give door-to-door to everybody, but unfortunately we can't afford to because we have to pay for other expenses like teachers and support staff and stuff like that.
Sure. So that funding model, like I said, 1994, Proposal A went into effect, and basically we changed that local dollars going to the school. Those dollars go to the state, are reproportioned by the state on a per-student basis, and now, as you have brought up, changing even more to try to adjust for those different cost factors.
Right. So a little bit of a history. You know, Proposal A changed on how schools were funded. Back before Proposal A, each individual school board would get a very little bit of money from the state, and most of it came from our own property taxes at a local level. So, and at that point, Michigan was determined to be a high, you know, tax rate for property. They wanted to change that model. So Proposal A went to the public, and it passed overwhelmingly. And so we changed the model from, you know, like 20% revenue from the state to about 80% revenue from the state. And that's where you had some significant changes. So Proposal A, funding comes from a lot of different sources. Lottery is one of them, but the lottery doesn't make up a big portion of it. It makes less than, about 10% of the total pot. So it's not going to really fund a model. So that's where you saw the increase in the sales tax go from 4% to 6%. So that additional 2% goes right to the school pot money that the state uses to fund schools. The other part is everybody had additional 6 mil state education tax, we'll see on it. That also goes to the pot. And the last part is the income tax was raised slightly. So those are the three big ones that fund it, but there's a lot of smaller pieces too in that.
I'm glad you brought up that lottery. People bring that up all the time. The lottery does a great job of marketing themselves. You see the big billboards, so many billions given to public schools. And that's a great thing. Don't get me wrong. But when you see it in a pie chart like this, putting it into some context of the impact that money really has on the budget, it really helps, like I said, give it some perspective.
Right. So what the state has done is determined, they took a snap picture of our funding in 1993. How much money were we raising locally? And they said that's the starting point. So at that point, some districts had millages expiring and others were doing funding a different way. So they were, like I said, winners and losers. So they took a snapshot of Dearborn at that time and saying, this is the amount of money we're going to give you per pupil as a standard number. They took away all the transportation funding and put everything into that number. And so right now for 22-23, we're at $9,372 per pupil for our funding for the general fund.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about, let's get a little local now. We got the kind of that overview of where those dollars are coming from the state. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other funding sources that we have, because there are other pots of money that we do get some funding from, majority though from that student foundation allowance. But let's bring it in a little bit local, and let's talk a little bit about our budget here in Dearborn and some of the funds, and I know it's not just one big pot, right? I mean, and that's all divided up into some other funds. So explain a little bit about how that works, Tom.
Well, people have to remember Dearborn Public Schools is not a private entity. We're a local branch of government. So we follow underneath the state law and the Constitution as a governmental entity under the state. So therefore, we are very regulated in how we spend money, how we can spend money, what we can spend it on. So the state has a kind of a hierarchy of funding models that we have to use. And I believe we have an illustration will be shown as we walk through this.
Sure.
So when you look at it, we have what we call pots of money. And pots of money can only be used for certain things. Just like you have maybe in your own personal household, you set aside some money for your mortgage. You might then have in a separate account so you don't mix it with your funds, so you always make sure you have money to pay back. Those are the things the state has set up, so we make sure that we have the money set aside and restricted for a particular purpose. So if you look at the picture that we have, starting from the right to the left, we have more restricted funds on the right, and as you move across the page to the left, it's more money that has least restrictions, so we can use it for different things. So on there, we'll get money for capital projects. We've done a bond issue. Last time we done a bond issue was 2002, and we went to the public and asked them to. 2014. Sorry. 2002 and then 2014.
Yep.
But when we do that money is raised for a particular purpose on what the ballot said we can spend it on. So that's what we call a restricted fund. So we get money from the public. We put that money in our what we call a capital project fund to spend for that purpose. It can only be spent for that purpose. Can't be used for salaries or other miscellaneous things. It has to be specifically for that purpose. In addition, we have a millage rate that we pay, that we levy to the public over those 20 years. We did 20-year bonds as usual in Dearborn. And so that money is put into a debt fund to make those payments. So that's the first two funds you see on the right. They're very restricted. We can only use it for that. We can't use it for anything else. And again, we get audited every year to make sure that we're following those guidelines. And I'm happy to say for at least the last 7-8 years that I've been here, they've been clean audits. We've been doing the things the right way. And the board has seen that year after year as we had our audit presentation, which we just had at our last board meeting, which is nice.
Good.
As we move to the left, we also get a lot of grant funds. We get money for the school lunch program. We get money for Title I through Title IV for our at-risk populations and subgroups. And those have to be spent on those subgroups. So they're not as restrictive because we have some flexibility, but that money has to be accounted for separately. Now, whatever is not accounted for is special revenue, debt, and capital project funds. Everything else falls in the general fund. And that's also where our per pupil money goes in, because we have the flexibility of how we spend it based on the board priorities.
I think it's important to point out that when you look at that general fund dollars, right, the large amount, I mean, we're a service industry. We employ people to provide a service. So obviously, what is that, 85% of that is going to go for salaries, correct? Or?
Right. We have roughly about $140 million salary base. So is that a lot for our district? It is, because we have a low teacher per student ratio on purpose. We did that because we know kids need the individual attention because of our subgroups. And so most school districts will be in that 75 to 85% range. All depends on their makeup of their community.
Sure. Okay. And then, so that means that if it's 85% in salaries, then you've got 15% for everything else, right?
Right. For transportation, paying utility bills, building maintenance, all those things.
All right. So let's talk a little bit now about, just looking at the history of kind of where those dollars have been and how they've been allocated and where we've where I know last year we saw a big reduction in some taxes that
Correct.
the school districts levy. And maybe a little explanation of where that all came from and why we did that.
Okay. And this kind of goes back to Proposal A, because before Proposal A, the board annually would decide how many mills, and a mills is the calculation of your home value at reduced by 50% divided by 1,000. One mill will raise that dollar value.
Okay.
So, for example, if you have a $100,000 household, taxable value would be 50% of that. Now, it will go up and down over years, but that's keeping it simple.
Sure.
And one mill would raise then, $50 on that $100,000 home.
Gotcha.
So that's how the millages system works in Michigan. And again, prior to Proposal A, that number could have been in the 30s, 20, 30s, depending on your particular district and your tax base. When Proposal A came away, that all went away, and we had to levy. They created two different taxing systems, homestead and non-homestead. So homestead is obviously your primary abode, where you would live at. Your non-homestead would be corporate areas, apartment complexes, those kind of things that are not your primary home. So they split the tax base in two. Okay. So we had to, by law, required to levy 18 mills on that non-homestead portion.
Okay.
So even though the voters that live in their primary home are voting on it, they're basically passing that vote on to, the non-homestead, the corporate, and second
Sure.
homes and those kind
businesses.
of
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
So we're required they raw then 18 mills. If we don't levy those 18 mills, the state's not going to make up the difference.
Gotcha.
They would actually give us less money in our foundation allowance because they're going to assume that you're going to levy that 18, so you kind of lose money. So we do that millage renewal every 10 years, and I believe it's coming up in a couple of years.
Yes.
So we'll have to actually, again, go out to the public and explain it all again and how it works. And typically we don't see an issue with that because schools know that's part of the budget already. Mm-hmm. And that's going to raise roughly about $32 million for us on an annual basis.
Okay. So a significant amount.
18 mills. Yeah, so it's a significant amount. If we didn't levy that, we could not make it up from the state. State would not make it up, so that would be a direct hit to our budget.
Okay.
So in addition to that, when they took that picture back in 1993 of our revenue source, we were what were called home harmless. So the average across the state, we were raising more revenue for our school program that we offered at that time and continue to offer, was generating more revenue. So we were allowed to levy a hold harmless millage. Okay. And
so that we wouldn't be damaged. So we wouldn't be
so we'd be held
hurt.
neutral.
We'd be held neutral. Okay. Because the state was actually going to give us in 1994 less money than what we had been generating locally.
Correct. If they didn't have this hold harmless option.
Okay.
And back then there was about a little over 30 districts. Now it's down to about 23 districts. Because over time the tax base has caught up to that, where the revenue would have raised on the normal model they didn't have to do it anymore. So,
Okay.
but we're still hold harmless. We're getting close, but we're still hold harmless.
Okay.
Now, and again, this is all a legislative process because we're state funded. So last year, they decided to change the nuance a little bit for us to get our full revenue. We had to reduce our hold harmless millage to do that. So last year, they told us in October that we have already had to lower our millage, but we actually levy a lot of our taxes in the summer. So
Okay.
we couldn't do it last year because it's been very complex to give refunds to everybody mid-year. So what the state decided for us is, and basically they decide, not us, because they control the legislative, that we're not going to levy the millage for the 22-23 school year,
Okay.
the year we're in right now. And it's basically, so that's why you see a zero millage on this year's, because we're kind of paying back the legislative change from last year.
Okay. And that is a result of that funding changing from the state. There was an increase in the amount of funding that came from the state.
Right. They wanted to give
Okay.
us more revenue, but they said we'd have to take some away to kind of balance this out.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's very simple, very clear.
Yes. Now, in addition to that, again, as we were talking about earlier, that 15% that we have left over after our salaries and
Sure.
benefits,
Right.
that is used for everything else. Now, as you're well aware, we have an older school district.
Sure.
A lot of our buildings are well past, the normal average for most school districts. And one of the ways we can do that allowed under law to raise capital, which is funds for our programs to improve the buildings or new buildings, we do what we call a bond issue. And that bond issue then affects the millage rate for the debt fund.
Okay.
That debt fund is like collecting money from the local taxpayers to pay off the money raised for the improvement. So it's kind of like a mortgage that we do to kind of pay back that loan that we're taking up front to improve the buildings.
And that's that, again, those funds are pretty restricted as far as how we can use those funds, and they have to go exactly for the uses that we had outlined in the proposal.
Yeah, and we have been as high as, the mid-5 mil range, all the way back to 2012. And over time, those, again, it's like any mortgage, you pay it off, so the money collected goes down slightly every year. And so now we're at the point where those 20 mil bond program we had in 2002 are coming off the books.
Okay.
So we have, if you've seen the graph that will show up there, that millage rate has been declining over time to the point where all we're going to have left is the 2014 bonds.
Okay.
And so those are what you'll see going forward. So you actually see we have been very astute in trying to make sure that the millage rate we charge to the public is only what we need.
I also know that over time, just like you had referenced that those when we do a bond issue, it's similar to a mortgage of your home, and similar to a mortgage, people will refinance their mortgage at a lower interest rate. We've been able to do that as well.
Correct. We've been actually very aggressive on that part. We've done 3 in the last 5 years, taking advantage of the low interest rates because of the current economy. We did one as late as last March and able to refinance some additional bonds, and that saves the taxpayer millions of dollars. They don't actually get the money back, but the millage rate reduces, so it's what they call saving in the future because we actually levy less millage.
Right. So you're ending up, that total amount at the end that you pay back is going to be a lot less because the interest rate has dropped.
Correct. Just like your mortgage. You refinance your mortgage lower rate, your payment goes down, and so you're saving money.
Well, that's a good thing. We all like to save money.
Yes.
So, Tom, we talked too a little bit about, you touched on this earlier, and I think it's important to touch on again. When you look at funding for the district and how we allocate those resources, again, we want to put those resources where they're needed in the classrooms, and kind of taking a look at where we are compared to our peer districts around us. It really looks like we've done a really good job here of putting those resources where they're needed.
Right. We are around the 70% free and reduced, percentage of our students. So which means that, we have a need there as a subgroup. We also are around the 50% mark for our ELO programs. So when you look at our staffing, we are, as a part of our program, we have to add additional staff in the support area to help those students because we're here all about student success. That's our primary focus. So to do that, we have made an actual decision to keep our class sizes lower. Okay. And with that, with additional support staff, you'll see that our ratios on our student per teacher ratio is one of the lowest around. You'll find it hard for people to really compete with us. And if you see the diagram that I'm sure that they'll put up here, that I got to take off my glasses to read that close. We're around the 15.4 ratio. And you'll see that most schools and the statewide average is much higher than us. And that's on a per pupil basis. So that exponentially, that's a lot of more money we're putting towards staffing costs to make sure our students have that one-on-one direction and instruction as they need it to make sure they're successful.
I think, too, it's important to point out that, we've heard a lot about student population statewide has decreased. Correct. And, districts are competing for students. They open up their boundaries so that they can grab students from neighboring communities and things like that. Important to point out that we've been fortunate here in Dearborn. We've had a very long trend of actually starting in the mid-1980s up into the 2000s, we had a huge increase in students, going from 12,500 students in the mid-80s all the way up to where we are now, 20,000 students. But really a nice, stable timeline of student enrollment increases and then just kind of even just stability flattening out a little bit as we see now in the later part of the 2015, 16 up till now, stabilizing out. But that's important is when it comes to our budgeting, correct?
Correct. And we believe there's open and closed districts, depends on schools of choice. Dearborn has always been a closed district. Unless you actually work here or for some special ed programs or early college programs, there's very limited access to come into us. So over the time, you can see that our population has grown tremendously over the last 20 years, especially on an average basis, which means we're overcrowded in our buildings too. Right. That's something that I know the board has been trying to address for the last couple of years, and maybe a future podcast on all those issues. But, again, it just shows that we're very proud of our families, of our district, and we have a great, interaction with our parents. Parents are very involved in the district, and you don't see that in a lot of districts. So it's a good district to live in, to participate. We always are welcoming, in our buildings. We always have open doors. We're always willing to talk. And that, I think the public likes that. And so that's why people move to Dearborn, because it's a good family-based district.
Sure. And, we've always prided ourselves on the neighborhood school concept.
Correct.
It's easy. Kids can walk to schools. I know a lot of them drive, though. But, they can walk and they can take their bikes. And the school is part of that neighborhood. Many times in the summer, you'll see families in our playgrounds on the weekend. And that's what we want. We want to be part of that community and build that community spirit in our schools.
And I just want to plug in that the board realizes that we have to change with the times too. So we do have a 30-year plan coming from a consultant that's working with staff in the community. I think they had almost close to 500 people a couple of weeks ago in just talking about that, just to see where we need to go. Because, it's just like anything else, you can't always stay stagnant because things change.
Sure.
So we're looking at visioning, so I hope people get involved and participate in this process. I think we just are sending out a survey on that here shortly to kind of get additional feedback, because we got to decide where we go as a district. It's not me running the district, it's not you running the district, it's the Board of Education, the community to decide where their district wants to go.
Absolutely, Tom. And that you're right, that whole 30-year visioning is about not just about buildings, but about education, about learning, about teaching, and how to integrate that into our facility needs in that big picture.
And that's going to drive the budget and what we use with our money, which is where it's always good to make sure you have that feedback, because we're very transparent. Our books are open. We have been lucky to be the recipient of the MBA award for the last 5 years, because we're trying to be transparent to the public.
Well, absolutely. And all of that information is available on our website as required. and people can find that information out very easily. Tom, just before we wrap up here, there is one last thing I want to touch on, and that is the ESSER funds. It's been a lot of discussion about that over the past couple of years, ever since COVID hit, and the additional revenue, additional monies that school districts across the state have seen as a result of federal dollars coming into the state and then the state passing that along to the schools. At first it was called COVID money, but ESSER is kind of the term that's used now. We've seen that come in 3 different waves, and maybe just an update of where we are with that. What are those funds used for? How did we use those funds? Some of that kind of information, I think that it would be useful to, kind of update everybody on where we are with those funds.
Okay, so over those 4 years, we've received roughly about $130 million. Again, you have to remember, these numbers seem large. We are the 3rd largest district in Michigan.
Sure.
Only Utica schools, which is about 4,000 to 5,000 more kids, and then you have Detroit schools. So we're the 3rd largest in Michigan. So these numbers may seem large, but for our size of our district, it's obviously the same amount every other district is getting through the COVID funds.
Sure. So
these funds were, again, grant funds, so they're very restrictive on how they get spent. So we are in our last tier, as you said. The ESSER 3 is the last funding source for our current COVID/ESSER funds over the years. We have already spent probably about half of that, so we have roughly about $40 million left to spend. Most of the monies we spent on were additional staffing. Again, mental health, social,
emotional,
all that SELs type stuff, because that was very important.
Yeah.
This was a change of dynamic that happened immediately with our students and staff, and we had to do additional training. They had to learn to teach online as needed. Students needed that interaction still, so a lot of money was spent on that. In addition, credit recovery. We obviously had 2 very robust summer programs the last couple of years. Typically, our summer programs are for the at-risk or subgroups. And so with opening it up to the entire district, we had largest, summer programs in the state. No one could compete with the programs, even Detroit.
Right.
So we had a lot of kids getting some additional social and emotional as well as the academic side over the summer. So
I believe 8,000 students in that first year. And then this last year, just about 5,000, around 5,000 students. So substantial. The first year was like $23 million of that just on that summer school program, and about 8 to 9 this last year. So, there's $35 million of the 130 is gone just the summer program for that social, emotional, and academic recovery. Now, the largest portion of ESSER 3, we're actually trying to do some building improvements. And that's needed because we're looking at the lower L's mostly, where we're doing air conditioning, air handling type activities, because in the summertime and even in the spring and the fall, we have those hot, cold days, having better conditions, and that was one of the monies that we could use it for. And as I repeated earlier, that we have old buildings. So a lot of our old buildings needed to be upgraded. So instead of going to the public for the money, we're able to use some of this money, roughly about $40 to $50 million on our building improvement to save taxpayers money also in the future for what they would have to pay through a bond issue. So I know there's a deadline for spending the ESSER money. Where are we in that deadline process?
So all the money has to be spent or obligated by September 23rd of 2023.
2023.
So December 30th of 2023.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the deadline. So we're on that path. Obviously, our construction, if you do any construction or ordering stuff in today's environment, it's late. It's always late, and it comes later again after they said that.
Sure.
And the costs have risen. If you try to get anything done these days, the costs have really rise too, because they're battling their shortage of staff and personnel and all that. So we're finding that what we originally planned had to be reduced a little bit. So we can't hit as many as schools. But again, that's where the focus is for the elementary level. And we have talked to the federal government, because this is federal money, about getting that 1-year extension for something that we've already obligated, which is the construction cost.
Okay, great. Wow. Okay, so it's a lot. We did a lot there and went over a lot, but like I said, I think it's important to talk about this and share this information as much as we can, because there's always new players coming in who want this information, and we may feel that, well, I just said this last year. We went through this last year. We went through this 6 months ago. But you always have different people coming and going and getting involved in schools, and they may not be familiar with some of this. So thank you, Tom. I appreciate you spending some time here with us to kind of go through this huge, complicated process of finance and kind of bringing it into just some simple terms to help us understand where this money is all going.
I get calls all the time from the public explaining things of, why am I paying this tax? Can I opt out of this tax? Those kind of things. And unfortunately, it's all state regulated.
Sure.
So we don't have a lot of control at the local level when you talk about taxes and all that. But again, it's just having that conversation so they at least feel that they're listened to and that we could help them if we could.
Absolutely. And we are not part of the city. The city and the schools are two separate government entities.
Yes, that is correct.
I think that's one of the more common questions I've had over my career. I'm sure you too, Tom, and yours. People just assume that the city and schools are linked together somehow, or we're not. We're two separate groups.
It's like Michigan State University and Michigan University. They are not the same entity. They're both governmental agencies, but they're not the same. Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Tom, thank you so much. We're always here because, and I think we always want to make sure that even in the finance world, that's the motivation for all that we do, including that part.
All right. Thank you for having me, David.
Oh, anytime, Tom. Thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody for, again, spending some time with us here today on School Matters, our Dearborn Public Schools podcast. So many topics to cover, so many important pieces of information, whether it be something very heavy like this, like budgeting and finance, or sometimes we'll be here talking about some more lighter, fun things as well, and some of the accomplishments and successes going on in our district as well. So for all of you who've taken some time to just stop by and listen, we thank you very much, and we appreciate that. And absolutely hope that you'll continue to check out our podcast, our School Matters podcast, right here in the Dearborn Public Schools.